While a lot of casuals might be familiar with Berserk thanks to the absurdly large size of Guts' Dragon Slayer, there is another sword in the series which is arguably far more interesting. It isn't too big, as one can wield it with a single hand quite easily. It isn't too thick, although it does have a rather unforgiving crossguard and grip. It isn't too heavy, as again, you won't be blowing out your back trying to get it off the ground, and instead of looking like a raw heap of iron, it looks like a proper, elegant sword fight for its knightly wielder. But don't let its design fool you into thinking it's yet another nobleman's fragile plaything. The Skull Knight's Sword of Actuation is quite possibly more lethal than the Dragon Slayer itself, and that, surprisingly, might have to do with its anatomy? Let's explore where we're going with this one together. This is the Sword of Actuation's anatomy explained. Is the Sword of Actuation the name of Skull Knight's regular sword? How strong is the latter? Now, every great sword has a name, so it makes sense that the name Sword of Actuation is associated with the Skull Knight's sword. Actuation is defined as the action people take for progressing towards achieving their objectives. As you'll learn in a bit, that does fit in with the purpose of the sword. But to be completely honest with you guys, the name of this sword isn't actually the Sword of Actuation. That's just the name Dark Horse gave it to make it sound cooler. While it does align with what the sword ultimately becomes, the Skull Knight's actual sword itself currently remains nameless. This is rather peculiar considering that most famous knights, fictional and otherwise, have names for their blades. Guts himself is the equivalent of a medieval knight in Berserk, and funny enough, he was technically knighted alongside the rest of the Band of the Falcon before his fateful fight with Griffith that snowy winter morning. Skull Knight, Knight of Skeleton, whatever name you want to use to call him, it doesn't change the fact that the only character identified as a knight has a sword without a name. However, that's not to say that the Skull Knight's sword is not a world ender in its own right. The Skull Knight's sword, in its base form, is a broadsword that's about the length of Guts' arm. The build of the sword is admittedly rather peculiar. While most of its blade length resembles a regular double-edged sword, its tip is shaped like an arrowhead or the tip of a spear. Towards the base, where it meets the hilt, Skull Knight's sword becomes more jagged, like a serrated knife. The hilt itself is dangerous to whoever wields the sword, because it is covered in thorny spikes that jam themselves into the wielder's grip, drawing blood every time they tighten said grip. And to complete this cornucopia of brutality, the Skull Knight's sword has a crossguard that makes it look like a thorn-covered Shiavona. Now, apart from its unique design, which draws inspiration from several sources, what makes the Skull Knight's sword stand apart from every other weapon in Berserk is the fact that it can slice through astral entities like a hot knife through butter. Usually, a person would require a magically charged weapon like the Salamander Dagger or the Sylph Sword or Farnesse's Silver Daggers to battle astral monsters. But Skull Knight's sword can turn apostles into a kebab dinner in absolutely no time at all. And yes, we did say apostles plural. He has shown time and again that he is simply unmatched at dispatching apostles, like when he pops into the Eclipse for a couple of moments and slaughters dozens of them on his way to Guts and Casca. Skull Knight also manages to pretty much single-handedly stave off the blood flow of the dead whilst rescuing Luca during the Conviction arc, and none of that would have been possible without his trusty sword. It takes Guts' immense strength, effort, and strategy to take out his targets with a sword as hulking and heavy as Dragon Slayer. Sure, it helps that he's a battlefield genius like no other, but he still puts in a lot of work that tends to go underappreciated in the grand scheme of things. Skull Knight, however, makes killing apostles look as easy as winning a 100-meter sprint unopposed. A lot of that has to do with his unnatural strength, speed, and battle experience as a 1,000-year-old wandering wraith. You can find out more about that in our Skull Knight anatomy video, so make sure you check that out after this. While it's usually true that a weapon is only as good as its wielder, Guts' encounter with this first apostle made him realize that he needs weapons appropriate for the job. The first weapon he actually uses after the Eclipse is the Skull Knight's sword, when he defends himself from his very first Night of Terrors, and we learn that Skull Knight's sword definitely meets the criteria for being an astral creature killer. This could have a lot to do with how the sword itself was created, which is what we'll be talking about next. How is the Sword of Actuation created? Is it alive? Now, the actual sword that Skull Knight carries around with him was most likely created by the dwarf blacksmith Hanar. In chapter 361, we learn that Hanar was not only the creator of the Berserker armor, but also the armor that houses Skull Knight's vengeful soul. It only stands to reason that he must have created the weapons, horse armor, saddle, and every other accoutrement of death that the Skull Knight carries around with him. This makes Skull Knight's sword capable of harming astral creatures on a baseline level. level, because we know weapons with deep ties to the arcane world in this series tend to be powerful against arcane creatures. A sword created by a master dwarf blacksmith like Hanar should be able to cut through apostles easily anyway. But as we mentioned at the beginning of the previous section, the Sword of Actuation isn't the name of Skull Knight's base sword itself. That's the name it takes on once it becomes one with Behelit. And how exactly does that happen? Well, via Skull Knight's skeletal guts. And no, we're not joking. For a very long time, one of the biggest questions Berserk fans had about the enigmatic Skull Knight wasn't where he came from or who he really was. It was, why in the hell does this guy keep eating Behelits? It was first picked up on in the aftermath of Guts' battle with Rosine, when Skull Knight showed up to survey the damage done to, and being caused by, his fellow struggler. Skull Knight notes that it appears as though hellfire had scorched the Misty Valley, and he expresses concern for Guts' current mental state. But then he does something unthinkable. He pulls out Rosine's Behelit from a tree stump and swallows it whole, as if it were a piece of candy. As the series progresses, we see him doing the same to the egg of the Perfect World's Behelit, and we keep wondering why in the world Skull Knight is snacking on the world's most dangerous eggs. Behelits are what create apostles and God Hand members. The Crimson Behelit, more specifically in the case of the latter. Maybe by ingesting them, the Skull Knight was preventing the creation of more apostles down the line. After all, by finding Rosine's and the egg of the Perfect World's Behelits after their demise, Skull Knight confirms to us that yes, Behelits will continue existing beyond their current owner's lifespan. But then comes chapter 221, and it basically changes everything we know about weapon tiering in the Berserk verse. Up until that point, Dragonslayer was the out-and-out favorite sword of every member of the fandom, even more so than Griffith's accursed saber or that Kushan Ramdao Zod used against Guts on the Hill of Swords. But then, in chapter 221, Skull Knight swallowed his sword as the domain of Kliphoff collapsed around him and Guts, and decided that he was going to take the top spot in that running. The reason Kliphoff was crumbling was partly Skull Knight's fault. He encouraged Guts to run through Slan's forced advent, which caused the life and death of the summoned interstice to boil into chaos, with the exits blocked and an innumerable amount of trolls and ogres manifesting from the chaos soup. Guts and SK had no escape route. Guts was so panicked by their predicament that when he saw Skull Knight put his sword down his throat, he called him out for trying out magic tricks in a life or death situation. When it emerged from his throat covered in Behelits, Guts' jaw dropped like he had actually witnessed a magical scene. Turns out the Skull Knight wasn't exactly digesting the Behelits he was ingesting, he was refining them instead. A Behelit might look like an egg-shaped stone carved with a peculiar face, it might behave like a stone for most of its possession, but it is a living entity. Why do you think it opens its eyes and stares at people who stare at it in a certain way? We were told that Behelits are living entities as far back as chapter 3 of the Black Swordsman arc, and when you consider how Behelits function themselves, that argument doesn't seem like insanity. If you think about it, a Behelit only activates when it drinks the blood of its owner, charged with their deepest emotions and desires. Once that happens, it rearranges its own face, lets out a scream that opens an interdimensional rift, and causes a human being to turn into a thrall of evil. The only reason a Behelit appears to be stone-like most of the time is because it only comes alive when it is needed. In that regard, the Skull Knight's Sword of Behelits is as alive as an inanimate object can be. When the Skull Knight brings his sword out, covered in he only knows how many Behelits, it does appear to take on some sort of sentience. The thorny crossguard can be seen opening itself up as it comes out and covering half of the Behelit-coated swords as opposed to just the wielder's hand. The Behelits themselves all have their eyes open and their mouths grinning at all times, which we know only happens when they're active. This is confirmed by the single panel shot of Guts' Puck's Betchy, shivering in its pouch as Skull Knight unsheathes his new sword. This is because Betchy resonates with the Behelits of the Sword of Behelits. We only see Betchy quivering and shaking about during moments like the Incarnation Ceremony or the Great Roar of the Astral World, both of which are deeply tied to its place of origin. So yes, in a way, we can say that Skull Knight's Sword of Behelits is alive, but it isn't a sentient blade in and of itself, resonance with other Behelits aside. There are many living weapons in fiction that truly live up to that billing. The greatest examples of such weapons to us would be the twin blades from the Soul Calibur series and Michael Moorcock's Elric of Melnibone series. In Soul Calibur, the blade known as Soul Edge serves as the main antagonist of the series, a blade bathed in so much blood and hatred that it has taken on a malevolent life of its own. Soul Edge is the one-eyed target you chase down with its twin Soul Calibur in the titular video game series. In Michael Moorcock's Elric series, the twin blades Stormbringer and Mournblade come from the same black sword, and are sentient, soul-sucking weapons weapons that feel more like flesh than steel. Mournblade and Stormbringer have a will of their own, and often influence their wielders' wills, which is why Elric ends up going down the path that he does in the series. In anime, perhaps the greatest example of a living sword we can think of that you would relate to would be Kisame Hoshigaki's greatsword Samehada. Samehada is a unique living blade that eats chakra and can blend with Kisame's physiology to turn him into a shark-like entity. It has a will of its own, as it tends to be friendly towards those that possess strong chakra and treat it nicely, evidenced by its choice to defend Killer B against Kisame himself in the final quarter of the series. But the biggest difference between these blades and the Skull Knight's sword, as you guys might have realized by now, is the absence of a free will in the latter's weapon. Skull Knight's blade cannot think for itself. Each individual Behelit embedded in it might have come into the physical world with a life and a purpose set forth for it by the idea of evil, but it doesn't influence the fate of its owner. A Behelit's job is to simply show up at the destined moment and help nudge their owners towards the dark side. That's far removed from drinking said owner's soul for kicks like Stormbringer does, so we cannot quite call it a living weapon. It's somewhere in that uncomfortable middle spot, and perhaps that's just as well considering what it does. What is the power of the Sword of Actuation? How is it connected to the Abyss? Now, the reason Skull Knight pulls out a Behelit-covered sword from his own guts to help save Guts is more than him just trying his hand at irony. A Behelit is, at the end of the day, a magical fetish. Yes, it comes associated with a fate of its own, dictated by quite possibly the only true god of the series, but that doesn't mean it cannot be repurposed to harness its abilities for other uses. Let us ask you this: what is the core function of a Behelit? Is it to dictate a person's fate? To help them fulfill it? To transform them into demonic entities driven solely by their baser instincts? No. The purpose of a Behelit is very simple. It's the key that unlocks the door between the astral and physical worlds. In other words, it's the very reason that an interstice is even summoned during any demonic ritual. The Behelit is a spatial object linked to the fate of a person, and when that person starts accepting their fate, this key opens up a fissure in their hearts through which the power of evil surges, should they choose to embrace it. Because the Behelit comes directly from the Abyss, it links its owner's soul to the Abyss, which powers their existence as an apostle, or worse, a god hand. What the Skull Knight does with the Behelits he ingests is he basically reverse engineers them. By melding multiple Behelits together and refining them within his own astrally powered body, Skull Knight repurposes them into a sword that can cut through space itself. He demonstrates this with the first slash we ever see the Sword of Behelits make, which ends up creating a one-way ticket straight to the Abyss for the countless trolls and ogres we were talking about in the last section. Now, of course, because the Abyss is the final destination of all those that get tangled with demonkind, especially those marked with the brand of sacrifice, evil spirits from the Abyss start chasing down Guts and Skull Knight. Guts is worried they have nowhere to run, which is when Skull Knight reveals that the sword doesn't just send people to the Abyss, it can also cut through other layers of the astral world to deposit its wielder wherever they choose to go. Guts is left dumbfounded by Skull Knight's second rescue of him, and understandably so, because the Sword of Behelits is an overpowered creation. Using this blade, the Skull Knight can, in theory, appear anywhere in the world within mere moments. Having spent 1,000 years traversing the astral and physical worlds as a wandering wraith, SK knows both worlds inside out at this point, and can thus effectively teleport anywhere to his heart's desire. If he aims his spatial slashes at a target, they will literally be sent to hell, while Skull Knight can just escape the vortex's radius on his super speedy steed. Cutting through apostles in milliseconds would become pointless, as SK could simply make them disappear now, which shows immense restraint on his part. He has likely been ingesting Behelits for decades, if not centuries, and Chapter 221 is the first time we see him choose to use their powers. Such a weapon could not only defeat countless enemies, as it already kind of has, but it could also save countless lives by making falling debris or enemy troops disappear into a completely different pocket of space altogether. But the main reason it was created was to defeat the entities that are powered by the same energy source that powers it, which is why this very video exists. So let's get into that. Can the Sword of Actuation defeat the God Hand? Let's go back to the beginning of the video to understand the final section a little better. In the beginning, we told you that actuation is defined as the action a person takes to progress their personal objectives. This definition holds up when you consider the purpose with which Skull Knight created the Sword of Actuation, because this blade only exists to help him carry out his life's purpose, defeating the God Hand. In Chapter 221, before unveiling the Sword of Actuation, Skull Knight mutters to himself that while the situation would be a good test drive, as the sword itself was only created to entomb them in that vortex, given that his hatred is laser-focused towards the God Hand as the leaders of the Inhumans, it isn't difficult to decipher who "them" stands for in that phrase. Skull Knight's very reason for existence at this point in the story is the downfall of the God Hand, and given that he believes his Behelit-covered sword to be the weapon to realize that goal, Dark Horse naming it the Sword of Actuation isn't actually too far off the mark. However, that's only true in the purpose of the blade's existence, because in execution, it has failed to achieve its stated purpose in disastrous fashion. After laying low for nearly 80 chapters following the Clip-Off incident, Skull Knight decides to surprise both us and Griffith when he pops up atop Ganishka's head in his Shiva form towards the end of chapter 303. We see the Sword of Actuation's spatial abilities being used optimally by Skull Knight in this ambush, as he manages to rush Griffith so unexpectedly even Zod can't react to him in time. Skull Knight lets loose a spatial slash in Griffith's direction with the intention of sending him back to the Abyss and hopefully saving the world from whatever demonic master plan he's got cooking for it. Instead, he watches in horror as Griffith not only anticipates his ambush, but also manipulates it to fulfill what appears to be a prophecy. As Griffith acknowledges the Skull Knight as the biggest thorn in the God Hand's side for the past millennium, he subtly mocks his predictability, and also claims that this attempted assassination was but a part of causality. One twice reincarnated and a sword stroke that reaches deeper still into the spirit world have opened the door. These are the exact words he says as he triggers the great roar of the astral world using Skull Knight's spatial sword strike. The phrasing here leads us to believe not only did Griffith, as Femto, anticipate this attack, it was probably predestined to play out the exact way it did. And we're not even sure if it would have worked the way Skull Knight wanted it to work, considering the God Hand is already intrinsically linked to the Abyss. While apostles have corporeal forms, the God Hand is incorporeal, a massive body of thoughts that exist in the deepest layers of the astral world. The only reason Femto was able to make it out of there was because of the awfully elaborate incarnation ceremony, which itself is only fated to occur once in 1,000 years. Skull Knight had the perfect opportunity to send him back to hell, especially now that he had a physical body atop Ganishka's head, but turns out it was never his opportunity to begin with. Now that the Great Roar has merged the astral and the physical worlds, who knows if the Sword of Actuation can even work the same way it did previously. While we have not seen the Abyss's manifestation in the series so far, we also haven't met the rest of the God Hand in the new world, so we have no idea what their current existences look like. On top of that, most of them are older than Femto and can probably perceive the flow of causality even better than he. Even if their fate deciphering skills are a bit rusty, their sworn enemy coming to kill them with a sword made specifically for that purpose is something they should be able to foresee at the very least. So the question then doesn't stay whether the Sword of Actuation could defeat the God Hand, it becomes whether the Skull Knight can beat them with it. The Skull Knight has a pattern of appearing at temporal junctions to oppose the God Hand. While this might be something that he doesn't have a choice in due to his existence as a wandering wraith, it nonetheless makes him predictable, even without causality. Couple that with the fact that he still seems to struggle against his own fate of vengeance, and you have a character that has the right weapon, but the wrong circumstances to wield it. For the Sword of Actuation to defeat the God Hand, it has to be used by someone not within the purview of their near omniscience. There are only two characters we can think of right now that fit that bill to an extent. The first one, obviously, is Guts. Guts has swam against the tide of causality his entire life, and has somehow always found a way out of his own fate. Zod told him he would die during Griffith's eclipse, but he didn't. In fact, Skull Knight told him the same thing the first time they met, and then ended up becoming Guts' unwitting savior. SK agrees that even at predictable temporal junctions, minute details like one small decision being made with a different mindset can end up altering the flow of fate itself. He calls Guts a leaping fish that breaks the surface of causality's stream to change the way it flows. So maybe if Guts wielded the Sword of Actuation, the results would be different. However, the problem here is Guts can only change minute details of the bigger picture, and not the entire picture itself, as evidenced by his failure to alter the course of both the eclipse and the incarnation ceremony. He managed to get Casca to Elfhelm and got her mind healed, but she ended up with such bad PTSD, she can't even see him without breaking down, which is something Skull Knight had predicted would happen. The finer details might alter the course of causality's flow marginally, but the overall current usually ends up holding strong. This leaves the only character to have ever struck a God Hand member in the series on our list of potential Sword of Actuation wielders, Rickert. Unlike Guts or even Skull Knight, Rickert is a guy who has made peace with his former life, as grief-filled as it was for him. He's the only one who mourned his fellow fellow fallen Falcons, the only one who made an effort to let something more than revenge or desire for a kingdom drive his life choices. The reason Rickert could slap Griffith in Falconia was because he didn't even see him as Griffith anymore. At the end of the Slapsgate episode, which occurs in chapter 337, Rickert rejects Griffith's offer to join up with him again by saying that his leader was the White Falcon. This new Falcon of Light is someone he doesn't know, which is an interesting distinction for Miura to point out, right after showing us Rickert doing the unthinkable and actually landing a hit on Griffith. It's possible that because Rickert no longer views himself as being part of Griffith's story, that him wielding the Sword of Actuation could end up doing the trick. But we won't know if this speculation is correct or not until the series actually ends up taking this direction. As of this moment, we don't see the Sword of Actuation making its comeback for a long time, but rest assured, when it does, it will be for something massive. And you can thank us for helping you understand how it works perfectly on that day. Marvelous verdict! But until that day comes, we're afraid that's all we've got for you on the Sword of Actuation's anatomy and purpose. We're confident that we'll see the blade appear again because it's an object of too great a strength to ignore. The Sword of Actuation could potentially hold the key to reversing the global interstice, as it is nothing more than the abyss spilling forth into the world after a fashion. But that's a possibility that our heroes need to spend more time exploring. What we need you guys to do is drop a comment letting us know what you think of the Sword of Actuation. If you enjoyed what we had to say, do consider giving this video a like, subscribing to our channel, and sharing it with your struggler friends. We aim to bring you only the best of anime content every day. Having said that, we'll see you guys in the next one, and until then, keep on struggling, strugglers.